Recently, I was invited to role-play an atheist at a Christian school. Now, normally when I do this, the audience will know that I'm actually a Christian, put on glasses, role-play an atheist. But in this case, the teacher introduced me as an atheist and I went with it. So students thought I was a philosophy professor at UCLA for the first 30, 40 minutes while we have interaction back and forth. Now, a bunch of questions came up and I responded as an atheist. Now, I take the glasses off about minute 50 in that video and then start giving a few responses. But since posting that video, I've gotten a ton of comments on social media, in the YouTube video itself, of people asking me to address the questions from a Christian perspective of what I actually think about the challenges that are raised. So here are responses to 7 of the big questions that came up. And I'm also going to just either link or mention a video or a book that'll help to take each of these in more depth. Enjoy. The first question that came up was about the existence of Jesus and whether Josephus, a Jewish writer at the end of the 1st century, is a good extra biblical source. Now, first off, even if we had no extra biblical sources, I would still trust minimally the existence of Jesus because of the different New Testament writings and the case that they are reliable. But with that said, Josephus is a Jewish writer, end of the 1st century, and has 2 references to Jesus of Nazareth. Yes, he mentions other people named Jesus, but in Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 18, there's a debated passage that references Jesus. Now, we won't enter into that debate here, but many scholars agree that that passage was interpolated or adapted later on, but there's still a historical core that refers to Jesus living minimally, dying, and at least being viewed as the Messiah by some of his followers. But a passage that's not disputed, as far as I could tell in my doctoral research on James, the brother of Jesus, is the passage in Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 20. The reason it seems largely undisputed is that there's really a political debacle going on, and Ananias kind of seizes authority, and it literally just mentions that James, the brother of Jesus the Christ, was put to death, and then it moves on. So both James and Jesus are mentioned so incidentally that it hardly seems the kind of thing that would have been invented. What's the bottom line? Josephus is one good extra biblical source for the existence of Jesus and also how Christians viewed him as the Messiah towards the end of the 1st century. Now, a second question that came up related to the multiverse. And oftentimes the multiverse is viewed as explaining away the fine-tuning in the universe. Some would say if there's a God, he could fine-tune it, but if there's an infinite or many worlds hypothesis, that could also explain why there's at least one or a few fine-tuned universes, and we shouldn't be surprised to find ourselves in a fine-tuned universe. Well, much could be said about this, but here's 2 ways that I think can be pushed back against this. Number 1, I don't think it's a wash between God and the multiverse, because God is a much simpler explanation for fine-tuning. All we have to do is posit one intelligent agent capable of fine-tuning the laws of physics and cosmology to explain away fine-tuning. But the multiverse posits many or an infinite number of universes to explain this. So God is arguably a simpler explanation. But even more pressing, even if there is some kind of multiverse, this is not going to get rid of the need for a mind and the evidence for design, which is a part of the purpose of the multiverse in the minds of many in the first place. Why? Well, think about this. An example that's given by Robin Collins. He says, if we want to know where bread comes from, you say, well, a bread maker. Well, that doesn't explain the need for design because we still need an explanation for the design of the bread maker. Well, in inflationary cosmology and string theory, you don't get rid of design by positing a multiverse. There still needs to be an explanation for why there is a multiverse generating fine-tuned universes such as ours, just like you need an explanation for a bread machine that was made to make bread. So bottom line is the multiverse is not a simpler explanation. And even if there were a multiverse, it wouldn't get rid of the evidence for intelligent design. I would recommend chapter 16 from The Return of the God Hypothesis by Stephen Meyer, or my interview with him. We go into this in depth. The third question that came up was a wonderful question. How in kind of a physical universe do minds and consciousness emerge? This was one of the best questions that a student asked. Why? Because the bottom line is there is no naturalistic explanation that can explain how dead matter can spawn a thinking, self-reflective, conscious being. There's none. I studied this in my master's program, and we looked at all sorts of different theories for explaining consciousness. Many will just go one route by saying they're agnostic. They concede there's no explanation. Others will just get rid of consciousness entirely. People like atheist Daniel Dennett take what's called more of an eliminativist position. But of course, if you get rid of consciousness, you get rid of thoughts, you get rid of free will, you get rid of anything material tied to what it means to be human, which raises a whole host of other problems. So bottom line, I think any honest atheist or naturalist would say, at least minimally, they don't know the mechanism of how consciousness or mind can emerge from matter. But this actually isn't a problem for a Christian or theistic worldview, because God, who is a mind, exists before matter. We are made body and soul, mind and matter. So it makes sense, if God is spirit, that we would be beings with spirit. So an argument actually can be made from the existence of the soul to the existence of God. I would check out the book The Soul by J.P. Moreland, or my interview with him, again, in which we go into this in depth. A fourth issue that came up was related to prophecy. I was asked, how as an atheist I explain away prophecy? And I just dismissed it with a range of different ways. And I said, give me a specific example. And the young man said, what about the birth of Jesus? And my response was to say, well, wasn't Jesus aware of the Old Testament? Couldn't he have just concocted his life and the story about him as if he was born there without giving any evidence? I want to think about this for a minute. What would that make Jesus? That would make Jesus a liar. That he intentionally lied about where he was born to concoct a spiritual story, to mislead people about their eternal fates. I've heard a lot of criticisms of Jesus, but to say he was lying and immoral and evil is a tough pill to swallow. I think a case can be made that he has given us the greatest moral teaching in the history of the world, and we're going to believe that Jesus was a liar. That's one big problem. But second, we actually have good reason to believe Jesus was really born in Bethlehem. The Gospel of Luke records this early on in the early chapters. That's the first century. In the second century, Justin Martyr reports details that line up with Luke about Jesus being born in a cave. In the third century, Origen says both friends and foes agree on the birthplace of Jesus. And then you get into the fourth century, and Constantine then builds a church over the place that it was said was largely known and believed. So we have a chain of custody going back. And this is why archaeologist Joel Kramer, again, I had a chance to interview, and we go into this in depth, says in his research, and he lives in the Middle East and has gone to the site and studied it, he says Jews and Christians and other archaeologists agree on the existence of Jesus and where he was born, even if they differ over his identity. Now, I think this is a good example of fulfilled prophecy, because we have in Micah 5:2 written long before the time of Jesus, and we know this because of the Septuagint and that translation before the birth of Jesus, and of course the Dead Sea Scrolls. It reports that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem, and in fact, Jesus was. If you want more on prophecy, check out the book Evidence That Demands a Verdict I wrote with my dad. We go into some depth on a chapter, and I think it's very fair, but makes a case for prophecy. The fifth question that came up was about a standard for love. A girl asked me, she said, if you don't believe in Jesus, how can you believe in love? Well, it's actually a fair question if you think about it this way. If you don't believe in God, and everything came by accident, then human beings are these physical, evolved, accidental beings, how is it that we even get such a thing as love? And how are we bound and obligated to love other human beings? Especially in our earlier question about consciousness, if you don't have an explanation for consciousness or an explanation for free will, you can't account for love, because love assumes such a thing as free will, that you can choose A or choose B. My wife's love for me really only means something because she's chosen me and not chosen everybody else and is faithful to me. So this is a very fair, good question. Now, as an atheist role-playing, I pushed back and I said, well, what about all the violence in the Old Testament? Now, look, this is a huge question that will go beyond what I can cover briefly here. I'll point you towards some resources, but keep a couple things in mind. Scripture teaches that God is the most loving Heavenly Father, and Jesus is the incarnation of love. So we see in Jesus him touching this leper. We see his compassion for the Samaritan woman. We see Jesus dying on the cross, offering his own life in the greatest act of self-sacrificial love in the history of the world. The love we see in God goes beyond anything, if we're honest, that we see in our own hearts. But we also see the judgment of God in the Old Testament and the New Testament, that God is holy and he cannot take sin, and sin requires atoning for. Now, some ways God allows and uses violence for judgment in a certain place at a certain time. That's unmistakable. But the point I want to make here is we see both extremes, you might say, when we look at the person of Jesus in the scripture. We see this deeper love and this deeper sacrifice, you can imagine. But we also see God's holiness. And both of those have to be kept together. Here's a link to an article that may be helpful. I walked through with a professor, actually not an article, an interview with a professor at Talbot School of Theology I teach with, and we walked through the different ways that Christians can make sense of Old Testament violence. If this is a question that bothers you, that would be a great place to start to make sense of this challenge. Challenge 6 was on morality. Somebody said, how do you have a basis for morality if you don't believe in God? Basically, I pushed back and I said, look, you can know right and wrong if you don't believe in God. Right and wrong is based on making choices that lead to flourishing of other human beings. And you don't need an ancient book to tell us this. Well, let me push back on this in a couple ways. If you say that flourishing is something humans should attain for, you're still saying that's something we should do, we're obligated to do, that it's right to do certain things and wrong to do others. That assumes an objective standard of right and wrong. And I don't know how you get that without there being a God. So many atheists want to say, oh, my morality comes from flourishing, but then they muzzle in design and purpose and moral obligation. That doesn't make sense in an accidental, purposeless material universe that has not been designed. On the flip side of this, realize if you're saying what is right is helping people, what is wrong is harming them, you're assuming humans have intrinsic value and that I shouldn't treat humans the way I treat a rock. But how do you get that in an atheist worldview? In a Christian worldview, it makes sense. People are made in the image of God and have value regardless of skin color, sex, where they're from, how much money they have. I don't know how you get human value. I haven't heard any good explanation how you get that without there being a God. So flourishing doesn't account for objective moral values and duties, which is what in our hearts we want to affirm. So for that and many more reasons, I think that explanation for morality falls short. The final one is I was asked, how do I explain away as an atheist the evidence for the resurrection? And I pointed towards what are often called these mystery religions of the ancient Near East. Mithras, Adonis, Osiris, Isis. And these are supposedly ancient stories that have the same characteristics as we see in the Christian story. Things like resurrection, things like born of a virgin, things like having 12 disciples, claiming to be God, etc. Well, what's interesting about this is when I was in college, I went through a period of questioning and doubt that was really pretty serious for me. And it was because the first time I heard this objection, I thought, Christianity is just ripped from these ancient mystery religions. It was unsettling to me, not only intellectually, but it was unsettling to me emotionally. Now I look back and can't believe I bought this idea because it's a bad intellectual objection. There's a whole bunch of problems with this. One problem is the dating, is that when you look at actual similarities that can be made between these pagan mystery religions and Christianity that are actually similar in any way, the evidence seems to show they come after Christianity rather than before. So if borrowing is taking place, you can make a case that at least in some instances, these pagan mystery religions borrowed from Christianity, not the other way around. The other thing is these similarities are exaggerated. So you hear these stories say Osiris was resurrected, Jesus was resurrected. Maybe Christianity is borrowed from this ancient Egyptian mystery religion. Well, if you just look at the story of Osiris being murdered, cut in the sea, thrown in the sea, cut into a whole bunch of different parts, thrown in a chest and becoming god of the underworld, there is no good reason to think Christians borrowed from somebody who was murdered rather than willingly laying down his life, and somebody who becomes a god of the underworld rather than actually being resurrected. This is just two of many problems. In fact, the third one is, if you actually want to understand Christianity, don't go to its pagan roots, go to its Jewish roots. I mean, Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees from the tribe of Benjamin. Jesus says in Luke 24, don't you know the scriptures spoke of me? So over the centuries, paganism did affect Christianity in different ways. But if we want to go back to its origin and understand the message of Jesus and the scriptures, going to pagan mystery religions is not going to help at all. What we need to go is to the Hebrew scriptures, the 39 books of the Old Testament. In the updated book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, that I wrote with my father, Josh McDowell, because this question of the mystery religions so rocked me when I was younger, I wanted to have the single best chapter responding to this. So in that book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, you will find a chapter responding in depth with footnotes to the mystery religion's claim and realize there's no good reason to think that can explain away the evidence for the resurrection. I hope this has been helpful. I realize there's maybe some other questions that were not addressed here. If you email me through my site, seanmcdowell.org, I have an assistant who'll do his best. He's super smart to find books, resources, articles to help. The books that I mentioned and the links to the interviews will all be below. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps.